We now find ourselves at the end of Jon Pertwee's era of Doctor Who. After portraying the character for 5 years throughout his 24 stories and 5 seasons of the show, Planet of the Daleks is very much the end of his era of Doctor Who, and the penultimate story for the producer, Barry Letts. And all of that makes this a very important story because it wraps all of these things up and gives you the final note to leave this era on. So how did this one do? You know what? It was a pretty enjoyable episode. There's definitely fun to be had within the story. It's got an interesting setup, albeit with some admittedly offensive as well as just questionable elements at play. Mike Yates is back for the story, which was honestly a bit of a surprise. There's several aspects of this serial that are seemingly only here so that the episode can actually function as a story, and all of these parts can fit together. And he very much feels like one of those aspects of the story, and that he's just, crowbarred in there because they need this thing to work in this particular way, so that this other thing will happen the way that they want it to. And that is showcased in how he connects Sarah Jane to the people meditating, which introduces the whole spider plot. But on the whole, he was fine within the episode. He didn't detract from it, but he also didn't add too much to it. And hey, at least he didn't like last time, so that's something. I was genuinely surprised to see the Doctor get a letter from Jo Grant, but that did put a little bit of a smile on my face.
So, Doctor, if you're away on a cheap day trip to Mars, perhaps you could look after it for me, Brigadier. Or if you're away in Geneva, how about it, Mike? Or my lovely Sergeant Benton. I must say I miss you all very much.
I do kind of wish it was a little bit more of a heartfelt moment than it was in the actual episode, but I was still just happy to see that character mentioned and to hear a little bit of the letter. But it also became clear that the reason for that letter was another plot reason. The Doctor needed to have that crystal from Metebelis 3 so that there could be a connection between him and a spider plot. So hopefully you see my point here about how this stuff is kind of being forced together to make this story actually even happen. And at times it does feel a bit unnatural. The Brigadier was fine within this one, he really didn't add very much, but he didn't take away from the episode either, same as Mike Yates, I guess. My favorite parts with him were just when he was with the Doctor. I enjoy their chemistry together, and ultimately, I am glad that the Brigadier was in this story. It would be odd, I think, to have a Jon Pertwee final story without the Brigadier. He's such a big part of this entire era, so if you completely ignored him for this final story, I think a lot of people would be pretty upset. Honestly, myself included, and I'm not even that big of a fan of the Brigadier, but you can't just leave him by the wayside for Jon Pertwee's final story, so I am glad he was included, and I do like the chemistry that he has with the Doctor.
You know, Brigadier, when I was a young man, there was an old hermit who lived halfway up a mountain just behind our house. I spent some of the finest hours of my life with that old man.
What are you talking about?
As far as Sarah Jane is concerned, she's pretty good in this one. We do get some nice screen time of her doing stuff on her own or at times with Mike Yates, and those scenes worked well for me, and I just enjoy Sarah Jane as a character, and I like seeing her get up to stuff. There's also a sizable portion of the episode where she isn't very involved in it, but I do like when she is around.
Where is everybody, though?
In there, most of them.
Well, that's more like it. Can I have a look?
Well, I don't think...
Now, that sweet little llama said to show me everything, didn't he?
Yes, but he didn't really...
Well, come on, then.
All right, but for heaven's sake, be quiet. Shh.
Now, I would like to take some time to talk about Jon Pertwee because I absolutely love this man as the Doctor. He is legitimately good within this story, as we've come to expect from this man. He's really just very charismatic throughout this entire thing, and I do enjoy the scenes that he has with Sarah Jane. They do have pretty good chemistry together, and of course he gets his moments with the Brigadier as well, which are nice.
I must look into the crystal myself.
But isn't that rather dangerous? I mean, look what happened last time.
I'll bear it in mind, Brigadier.
As solid as Jon Pertwee is in this role, and he really is solid, don't get me wrong, I can't help but feel that this story didn't give him very much room to really explore the character one last time. He has some good scenes and did a good job as always, but I thought it was a bit of a shame that there wasn't more material for him to work with throughout this serial. Now, had they made this story with Roger Delgado, I can't help but feel that this territory would probably get more explored, but unfortunately, due to the tragic passing of that actor, that story was never made. And of course, although I do feel it is relevant to this review to mention that Planet of the Spiders was not the original way Jon Pertwee was meant to exit the show, I am of course judging this story for all of its good and bad elements, as it has been released, without allowance for the original intent of the creators, although I am very sympathetic towards the position that they were in when making this serial. So this one does run at 6 parts long, and this era of the show is no stranger to 6-parters. And the thing with them is, if the story has a real direction to it, and it has a writer that does a really good job at pacing its elements really well throughout, then you don't really feel the length of the story, even if the same story could have been told in 4 parts, or at the very least, that's what my experience has been. The problem for me with this episode is that it doesn't feel like it's managed to balance all of its elements, and they don't flow naturally between each other. We change locations around episode 3 for a significant portion of the story, which gives the serial a different style to it and ultimately winds up feeling a bit disjointed with the rest of what's going on. The show has done that before, where it has changed locations about halfway into the story, which has given the episode a bit of a different flavor to it, but for that to work, there needs to be something driving the episode, something to keep it engaging, which this story just completely lacks. The villains, which could have been one of the driving forces of this story, completely fail to do that for me. I found the spiders to be ultimately quite dull villains, and there was very little in terms of engaging presence or personality to them, and they really weren't very intimidating the way that they were presented in this lighting and the way that they are shot. And the problem with this one isn't that, oh, they didn't do these specific things that I went in wanting it to do. No, I didn't have specific expectations of things that I wanted the story to do, but I am looking at what they did and seeing potential, missed potential that was there. They didn't do much with the spiders, so I point out that these are some ways they could have done some things. They could have made them a little bit creepier, a little bit scarier, presented them in a more atmospheric way, and the way that a lot of these elements are presented is just lacking to me. So I'm not saying, hey, this is the way that it needed to be done. What I am saying is here's a way that it could have been done, and the way that it was done was a little bit disappointing and feels like it missed some potential. And I really do believe that this serial could have been cut down to 4 parts and would have worked much better. It probably still wouldn't be a great story, but I think it would just drag less. In part 2 of this one, we spend half of the episode in this extended chase sequence, and it is kind of fun, but it really didn't need to last so long. I mean, it must have been over 10 minutes, which is just crazy. If you've been following these reviews, then you're likely aware of how I'm not the biggest fan of the action scenes within Jon Pertwee's era, but I have to admit that over time they did grow on me. They grew on me to the point that by the end of this era, they really did feel like a part of Doctor Who, or at least this specific incarnation of Doctor Who. But I must say that this episode did feel as though it overdid those action scenes a little bit. There's one very unfortunate aspect of this episode that I would be remiss not to mention, and yeah, it's the racism.
When everything is new, can anything be a surprise?
I see.
Hurry now.
I mean, we've seen this before in Doctor Who. It was bad before, and it is still bad now. I think this is the 4th time Doctor Who has darkened the skin of white actors to portray non-white characters, and yikes, it's as bad as it sounds. I'll talk about the actual characters when we get to the spoiler section. They both worked fine for me, but their portrayal within this story was rather offensive, especially because of the accents used by these British actors.
Understand your distress at losing a valuable piece of equipment, Doctor. However, I feel you are mistaken in suggesting that Mr. Lupton had anything to do with it.
Yeah, this is bad. Alright, so moving on. As a send-off for this Doctor, the story does its job well enough. I really wish it hadn't been this one to close out his tenure, but it managed to do a decent enough job, and I did enjoy the story. As said before, I wish Jon Pertwee had been given more to do as an actor, portraying this character in his final appearance in his run as the Doctor, but I enjoyed what I got, even if it does feel a little bit disappointing as an end to his era. Alright, so I'm going to dive into some spoiler territory now, so do skip to the time as shown on screen to avoid those spoilers. First, I just want to get this out of the way. I absolutely adore the cliffhanger for episode 4.
You're alive! I knew you'd come! Oh, Doctor.
Sarah Jane just being so disappointed at the Doctor being captured is a huge mood, and I just love this as an end to an episode. Obviously, it isn't a dramatic cliffhanger, it's just kind of silly, and I love it for that. I do want to talk a little bit about Metebelis 3 as a setting because to me it's just very uninteresting and bland. I kind of enjoyed the atmosphere that we got from the first couple of episodes within the story, but to be honest, the switch in settings really didn't work for me. Not only is this setting quite bland, but the story honestly is a little bit stale during this portion and really doesn't feel that it needs to be taking up this much space in the overall serial. Also, these characters on Metebelis 3 really added very little to the story. I don't mind that they look really goofy, but I do mind that they just aren't that interesting.
A stranger, where from?
Why not ask her? Where do you come from, child?
I'm from Earth.
From Earth? But how? Did you come in a starship like our ancestor did?
I do want to talk a little bit about the Tibetan monks within this story. I've already mentioned the offensive accent and makeup within this episode, which is pretty awful. But in terms of the actual characters, well, they really don't work for me that well. And when I say characters, I do actually mean character.
Choji is a projection of my own self.
We find out that this character is a Time Lord and was a teacher of the Doctor.
Yes, he was my teacher. My guru, if you like.
And in fairness, that's a bit of an interesting revelation, but I didn't feel that the actual character added that much to the story, and it's always possible that I was predisposed to not enjoy these characters' presence because of the racist accent and makeup, but I don't really know if that was the case. I just know that he didn't work for me. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the actual regeneration of this story. I do like the final moments from Jon Pertwee. They are his best moments of this story, and I like the way he goes out. He has a line about facing his fears, which really worked for me.
Oh, Doctor, why did you have to go back?
I had to face my fear, Sarah. I had to face my fear. That was more important than just going on living.
And I do think that his final moment with Sarah Jane is just a nice, sweet moment to end on.
Tear? Sarah Jane? No, don't cry. While there's life, there's...
Unfortunately, the Doctor's teacher shows up once again to give him a little push with his regeneration, and this moment just does not land. It kind of sours his regeneration a little bit. I thought it was great to have this regeneration be with Sarah Jane and the Brigadier, but then we get this character who was only introduced during this story, and it just doesn't feel necessary. I really think the moment would have worked better had he just regenerated without the help of his old teacher. I kind of get why it was done, to sort of make the story have something else to it, so it's not just a very straightforward regeneration, and you can have an issue that he has, which his teacher sort of helps with as he pushes him along. I get why it's done, I'm just not sure that it was necessary, and I think the moment would have landed better without that having been done. But on the whole, it is still a good regeneration, even if it is lessened for me because of the interjection of the Doctor's old teacher.
I think it's starting.
Well, here we go again.
Overall, I enjoyed this story. It was fun, it was a tad messy with elements that didn't entirely naturally flow together, but there were aspects of it that I found entertaining, particularly the Doctor and Sarah Jane. As an end to this era of Doctor Who, it does ultimately feel a little bit disappointing, but there is still quite a fair amount to enjoy about this one, especially Jon Pertwee's final moments as this character. I had a pretty decent time with this story, and I'm going to give Planet of the Spiders a rating of 7 out of 10. We have now reached the end of Jon Pertwee's run as the Doctor. This was a large era spanning across 5 seasons with some absolutely great pieces of television throughout. I have had a blast with his era, and I am really glad to have seen it because it's probably my favorite so far, and I am eager to see what the future holds in store. If you join me this coming Sunday, I will be bringing you my review/overview of Season 11 as a whole, It's definitely an interesting one to discuss, and I look forward to going over the whole thing with you very shortly, so I hope you join me for that, but if not, that is absolutely just fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.